Hi everyone, it's me, Ella, and welcome back to my channel. Last week I went to see Juliet on tour again, this time in Nottingham. I saw it twice with not one, but two different Juliets, and so for today's video I thought it would be a good idea to do a theatre-going overview of my experience seeing both shows. If you remember from my previous Juliet video, I last saw the show in Leicester in February and noticed quite a few changes to the production since it was at the Shaftesbury Theatre in London. When I was in Nottingham last week, I picked up on one more tiny little change which I will touch on in this video at some point. Without further ado, let's jump into today's Juliet theatre-going overview. Okay, so as I have just mentioned, I had the privilege of seeing two different Juliets last week. The first show that I went to was the Thursday evening show, and we were running a little bit late on this one, as by the time we got into Nottingham we only had 15 minutes left before the show started. We decided to use this time to go and buy some merchandise. Now, when I was in Leicester back in February, I was only able to buy the programme as they had unfortunately sold out of most things that I was after. However, in Nottingham, I was a lot more successful as I was able to hunt down the rest of the merchandise that I wanted. So I bought the pink Romeo hoodie, the Broadway cast recording CD to go with the London cast recording CD that I had bought after coming back from seeing the show at the Shaftesbury, the souvenir brochure and a Nottingham programme. So after my very successful merchandise shopping trip, we then went into the auditorium and found our seats. At this performance, Juliet was played by Gerardine Sacdalan and Romeo was played by Liam Morris. If you saw my previous Juliet video, you will know that this is the exact same pairing that I saw in Leicester. It was wonderful to see them perform together again. Geraldine, what can I say other than lovely voice, left me absolutely speechless, and I feel so lucky to have witnessed her perform as Juliet one last time. Liam Morris, he was so funny in his line delivery, absolutely hilarious. Stunning performances given by the pair of them, and above all it was an absolute joy and a pleasure to see Geraldine and Liam perform together as Romeo and Juliet again. If you would like to see more of my thoughts on Geraldine and Liam, you can have a look at my previous Juliet video where I explain all of the changes I have noticed to the show since it was at the Shaftesbury Theatre in London. Anyway, I loved the performance so much, and by the end of it I was absolutely covered in confetti from Raw. All I'm going to say on this is if you know, you know, but I was absolutely covered in it. In fact, so much that I even ended up taking quite a lot of it home. Seating for this performance then, we were row G in the stalls, seats 1, 2 and 3. I booked these seats so that I could be as close to the stage as possible without having to crane my neck to see the flying moments. For the purpose of which I booked these seats, they worked pretty well. However, the person in front of me was unfortunately blocking my view, so whenever the performers were central, so here, I was fine. However, if the action was mainly taking place on this side or this side, I had to lean to the respective side in order to see, which I'm going to be honest, was a bit of a nuisance. However, When we went into the auditorium to find our seats before the show started, I noticed that the end of row seat in front of me, so row H, was sticking out on its own side a little bit, and I looked at that seat thinking, if I'd have known the end of row seat on row H was sticking out on its own side, I would have gone with those seats as opposed to row G, therefore leaving me to have the better view. So ultimately, that was an error on my part for not realising at the time of booking. So, my advice for Anne Juliet would be, if you know that there is an end of row seat that sticks out on its own side at the venue that you're going to, especially if it's a couple of rows from the front, make sure you try and book it if you can, because that way you will have the better view and be able to see not just the flyers, but everything that's happening on stage centrally and on both sides. So do not make the same mistake I did and plan your seating solely around the flyers. That would be my advice, because ultimately with Anne Juliet, you want to be able to see everything that's happening on stage and not just the flyers themselves. Right then, moving on to my second show, which was the Saturday matinee. At this performance, the role of Juliet was played by the alternate, Psalms-Nissi Myers-Reid. And believe it or not, this was actually my first and last time seeing an alternate Juliet, because when we went to the Shaftesbury to see it, we had Miriam. I absolutely adored Psalm's portrayal of Juliet. She has got such a powerful voice, and I loved how she was able to put her own spin and stamp on the role, which I think is what makes her portrayal of Juliet so unique. If you are lucky enough to see Psalms, let me tell you now, you are in for an absolute treat. The role of Romeo at this performance was played by Jack Danson, who was the main Romeo. Now, there is a reason why I'm saying was, because when I got back from the Saturday matinee show later that evening, I had some news that the original Broadway Romeo, Ben Jackson Walker, would be coming back to do the rest of the UK tour, and Jack Danson would be leaving the show. I feel so lucky and privileged to have been able to see one of Jack's final performances, and he came together really well with Psalms. It is a shame he's leaving, but I absolutely loved his performance nonetheless. Seating for the second show, I was in box D in the dress circle, which was a much better view compared to row G in the stalls for the first show, which ultimately was a stupid error on my part. But anyway, the view from box D was much better because not only did I get a decent view for the flyers, but I was also able to see all the action on stage, central, left and right, which got a big thumbs up from me. However, the only downside to that seat was at the end of the show when Anne says, "Everyone has to dance," at which point everybody in front of box D stood up and blocked my view, which I didn't mind so much because it was the end of the show anyway. And another slight downside to that seat was that the confetti from Raw does not reach up to the dress circle. It only hits the stalls. But as I say, these are only minor downsides and didn't really affect my overall theatre-going experience, as those two things are at the end of the show anyway, so it didn't matter so much. Other than those things, however, absolutely fantastic view. Oh, now, being as we're here, the other change to the show that I noticed in Nottingham last week was that Juliet no longer uses her yellow jacket. She did have a yellow jacket at the Shaftesbury, but for the UK tour, she just uses the pink one, which I think is a lovely change as it suits the character really, really well, in my opinion. Overall, I adored seeing Anne Juliet twice during its stay in Nottingham. Nottingham. I had a wonderful time at both shows, despite the little hiccup with the seating for the first one, which again was a stupid error on my part for not realising about the stick-out seat in front of me. However, I feel so lucky not only to have witnessed two different pairings for Romeo and Juliet, but also to have witnessed one of Jack Danson's final performances as Romeo. I will miss Juliet so much, and it has been an absolute joy and a privilege to see this wonderful show again. The whole cast have been absolutely brilliant, and both Juliets I saw last week were amazing. I will forever hold on to the precious memories of not only the UK tour, but also my trip to the Shaftesbury Theatre as well. And on that lovely, lovely note, this Theatregoing overview for Juliet has now come to a close. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will see you very soon for my next video. Bye!